welcome Dirk Bennett, whom we haven't seen or heard from for a long time. Not true, we have heard from him. He had a wonderful essay in our 50th reunion production. And it's been absolutely wonderful to hear from you. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So, why don't we open with a quick background? You're originally from Texas, right? And
Correct.
you wound up in Williamstown. What
Yes.
kind of a shift is that? What's Tell us about Texas and tell us about what it's like to go from there to Williamstown.
It wasn't that different because there was mainly was getting used to accents more than anything else. So just get, especially the New York accent, that kind of thing. But the only the other big cultural difference was the weather.
Yeah.
I saw real snow maybe once in my first 18 years of life,
Uh-huh.
until I went off to college. So that was kind of dramatic. And now I didn't find the cold that damaging. In fact, I can remember, or that hard to bear. In fact, I can remember. I don't know if you ever did this. The steam tunnels were someone discovered the steam tunnels, and we used to get into them and go around even during the coldest of weather. And one guy showed up in the middle of winter. I think it was Greylock, a classroom in Greylock, that he was wearing, I'm not kidding, a t-shirt and flip-flops into the class because there was some kind of exit from the tunnel in Greylock, as I recall. And so he showed up, and people couldn't believe that he could bear the cold weather that whole way. But I don't ever remember even getting caught. I think if we'd been caught, we probably would have been disciplined severely. But anyway, that was one thing about Williams that I remember fondly.
And a good way to keep warm, as you said. Yeah, I did hear about those. I never went there, but our classmate Tom Bell, who was known for not always obeying the letter of the law, was also a frequent visitor to the steam tunnels. So
there was the other incident of behind the Clark Museum. We used to go lunching. We
oh
take the
yeah,
trays.
lunching with the trays. Yeah,
Yes,
that
yes.
was, and that word lunching. Yeah, that
Right.
was I think something that we invented. And there was also traying. I remember doing that with
Yes,
Tom Stevens, my roommate, who's from Hawaii,
right.
and he got one of those huge waiters trays, and we went out to Gobi Mountain just as it was closing down,
Yeah,
and he tried to stand up and surf on them. It's always
yeah.
amusing to see who would hit the ground first. So as I understand it from an earlier conversation, you didn't head to Williams directly. You went to a prestigious Ivy League school first. And from there, you decided you would much prefer a different environment. Can you take us back through that decision and how that worked out?
Yeah, I was at Cornell my freshman year, and at some point along the way, I decided to switch. My original idea for a major was chemistry, and I quickly decided I wasn't going to be studying chemistry the rest of my life, or the whole 4 years. So I switched into history because I enjoyed some of the class that I had there, and I was told that by my senior year, unless I took some rather bizarre or out of the way or esoteric kind of history courses, I'd be lucky to be in a class of under 50. So I decided I could go to a state university and get that kind of education. I mean, a good state university. I mean, there are a lot of them around. So I was looking for a smaller school, and I was lucky enough to be able to transfer to Williams. And my time at Williams, I think I was in maybe two classes that were over probably 30 students. That was Econ 101, 102, and the course on modern drama taught by Neil McGaw. Those are the only two classes that I had that were in any way, shape, or form big. Most of the classes were 15 or under, I would say. Some of them, like, was it Francis Oakley's Reformation history class? I think there were 6 of us in there. So, and I enjoyed that quite a bit because the thing about Williams was different from, say, being at a bigger university. I considered what went on outside the classroom just as important, if not more important, than what went on in the classroom. In this respect, you could meet with professors after class or in between classes in the snack bar and have a great conversation. You were treated pretty much as equal, except for the professors that insisted on calling you Mr. Bennett or that kind of thing. But and he's, but they other than that, I mean, there was no problem with having very good interchanges with teachers and students, for that matter, outside of class as well as what went on inside of class. And you became friendly with certain professors. I think, as we talked about before, there was always the Giffords place on on the warm days of spring coming up, or the early onset of autumn, when you could just drop in on the Giffords and stay for dinner, and then a lot of things afterwards, if you recall. So anyway, those are really meaningful experiences. I mean, they were good to get to know people, plus the interchange of ideas and whatnot was, as I say, really important to my experience at Williams.
It was an exciting time too.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, who are the faculty members, the professors there that most come to mind? You mentioned Don Gifford.
Yeah, well, Gifford, I only took one class with him directly. I did sit in on his American literature class because I found it much more interesting that he had a perspective that I wasn't getting in my other class. I just sat in on that kind of auditing. And then I quickly learned at Williams that I picked classes by who was teaching pretty much just as much as the subject matter. So I picked, of course, classes with Gaudino. I had a couple of courses with him. I would say Francis Oakley also. As I say, I mentioned Reformation history. I mean, how many students at Williams were the other people in the class? I think they were 3 of the 6, I think, in there went on to divinity school. All right. So, but they weren't, but Oakley had an interesting way of teaching, as did, any of those professors that I mentioned. I mean, they wanted to, it was not just, it was the thing about Williams, which they were really good about, and I wasn't majoring in a science, so I really couldn't speak to that, but it wasn't so much important about the content, although that was there. It was really the process. In other words, you had to not master, you had to be at least pretty well familiar with the major developments, whether it was history, political science, or whatever. But it was the way of getting to the knowledge. And sometimes, for instance, I remember Oakley in the Reformation class, we had to read 3 treatments of Martin Luther. One was Roland Bainton, who was a Reformation historian, I think, at Yale. One was the play called Young Man Luther, and I've forgotten who wrote that. And the other was Eric Erickson's treatment called, that Young Man Luther was the name of Eric Erickson's book on Luther. Uh-huh. And I've forgotten what the play was, the playwright, but he was well known. And you had to kind of come at Luther from these different perspectives. And it was, none of them were either right or wrong. It was just, you had to get into their perspective and what it meant in terms of you increasing your understanding, or at least some understanding of Luther. So it was that kind of interest that I found at Williams in the way things were taught.
So it didn't bother you to be in this tiny little community tucked in the northwest corner of Massachusetts with no major urban attractions?
That wasn't as important as the fact that there weren't women.
Okay.
That was much more important. I think that was a real shortcoming of Williams, which was soon remedied right after we left, basically.
It was too late for us, but it did happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And, once again, according to Gifford, who sat in on that one of the committees to discuss whether they were going to go co-ed was he put forward the economic, I mean, at least one of the things that won the day on Williams going co-ed, and once again, this is from vague memories of mine, so it could be inaccurate, was it was shown to the administration or to the trustees that they needed to increase the size of the student body by a certain amount to maintain a certain viability. And it was easier, it was cheaper to increase the number of students by adding females than males, in the sense that, and this is going back more than 50 years, so it may be a lot different today. If you increase the number of women, you don't have to increase the number of faculty as much. For instance, once again, this may not be true today. Languages, the arts, things like that. In that day, this is going back a ways. In that day, women would take more courses in those areas than men would. So you didn't have to increase your faculty as much to increase your student body, the size of the student body.
So that was part of the calculations?
Well, that was a story I think Gifford explained once. And the other part was that the alumni that would have been opposed to going co-ed, the most vociferous group, they discovered they weren't making many contributions at all, whereas and I could be wrong about that, it may have been the idea of getting rid of fraternities, but at least on this other point, the number of alumni that had only daughters, had no sons, was very high. And therefore, if it was possible for the daughters to be able to go to Williams, they saw it as a way to have them make more contributions to the endowment. So, I don't know if that worked out or not, but.
And the continuity as well. I think Williams prizes the notion of family,
right,
a great deal. So what about, this was a very exciting time, music, theater. I think you were involved in theater. I remember seeing you, but what about the political arena? I think you were in Brooks House, which was kind of a hotbed.
The hotbed, yeah.
Revolutionary fervor.
Right.
What was that like?
Well, it was exciting, although it was beginning to, it was the class. Williams had no, let's see, if I entered my sophomore year, it had no seniors for some reason, and I've forgotten what it was. So it was only the juniors ahead. And then, but there was a rump contingent of SDS, although SDS was no longer that major of thing at Williams by the time that I went there. So it was more important, I think, in the years right before I got to Williams. But I remember my senior year, I took over the Civil Rights Committee because no one else was interested. And by that time, the Black Power movement had started. So the blacks at Williams, and they numbered their number had increased quite a bit by our senior year. The blacks weren't interested because of the Black Power movement and whatnot had started. And I think the Civil Rights Organization had kind of lost its attraction to most people.
Well, there were some exciting moments that I remember, and I'm sure you may as well. A visit from Lady Bird Johnson, which was focused on ecology, not politics, obviously. And then there was, I think it was Westmoreland that came, that created a lot of excitement there.
I think in terms of the Lady Bird Johnson thing, some of us was it the beginning of the year? Was that? It
was the
convocation.
Yeah.
Convocation. Some of us, I think, stood up and turned our backs to Lady Bird Johnson as a protest. We couldn't see why. There was the contradiction between, I think, the environmental thing and what we were doing in Vietnam. So there was a handful of us that did that. I don't remember how many participated, but that was definitely there. And no one ever said anything other than Charles Fuqua, who was the classics professor, I think. He came up and said what a great thing that we had done. So, but that was it. I mean, no one in the administration said anything. We didn't shout or scream or anything. We just did a silent kind of protest, as I recall. So
A lot of people were going to Washington and New York for major demonstrations, but
yeah, I
you,
remember there
yeah.
was this could have been my junior year when there was a thing at the Pentagon, and we
Mhm.
figured that some of us didn't go because we'd been to so many of them by that time that I think about 80% of the student body at Williams attended one of those demonstrations. I think it was one at the Pentagon, if I'm
Right,
not mistaken.
right. Well, I do remember on our graduation, Tony Croman addressed the class and gave some very fiercely held opinions about Vietnam. And I think that when he finished, maybe 85% of our class was standing up for a standing ovation. Does that come through to you?
Yes, I recall that. Yeah,
Yeah,
that sounds about right.
yeah. But that wasn't certainly, I think you have a good point that the actual day to day at Williams was not like it would have been, say, at Berkeley or Madison, where things were a little bit more revved up. Um,
Yeah,
one
I think
thing,
nothing major went on the campus.
yeah,
No one ever tried to close down the school or occupy the president's office
yeah.
like at Columbia in maybe a year after we graduated. With Mark, was it Mark Rudd? I
Mark
think.
Rudd. Yeah. Well, I think the African American students did make their presence felt in Hopkins,
Yes.
but then we were gone at
Yeah.
that point in that sort of scene. One thing that caught my eye as I looked back at your essay that you contributed to the 50th year class book was the word serendipity. And
Yes.
you seem to say that a lot of things that followed from your after your student days at Williams were determined in that way. And I know a little bit because we had a chance to chat, and I wondered maybe we can explore a little bit about how you mean serendipity. First of all, it might be good to tell folks at the very top level what you did after you left Williams, which is a fascinating story. And then we might touch back
Okay.
and look
Okay.
at that. Yeah.
Yeah, I went on to live and work in Taiwan for about 30 years, and I did most of that time I spent as a journalist, doing radio, TV, as well as print journalism. And then I worked in kind of switched professions, although not really skills. It didn't require a new set of skills. I worked in a financial company, a mutual funds company, actually the first local one established in Taiwan, which was anyway, it became uh, I kind of wrote a lot of the reports from this mutual funds company. So that was kind of two sides of my career in Taiwan. Uh, and we can, if you want to, we can get into how that happened. But
Yeah, I think we will. But first,
yeah.
after Taiwan, you
Well,
returned to the States and
yeah, after Taiwan, I came back to the States and I was living in a retirement community, and there were some people. I don't know how I got involved with it, but there was a group of people that had been involved in some of the early climate research, starting in Hawaii, with where they did something measuring CO2 versus the warming of the atmosphere going back into the early 60s. And then there was another person there who was a physicist who was whose field was solar cells. So we ended up getting together and doing stuff on climate change, and did some public lectures as well as writing some articles that were actually published in some kind of very technical journals. But most of that was done with the more or less the guidance of the physicist who seemed to know where anything could get published and how to publish it. In other words, I didn't read any technical journals, but Larry, the physicist, seemed to know when I was writing about various things how to put my references, convert them to references in academic journals so that it would be acceptable to the places that we would have stuff published.
uh-huh.
So that was a lot of fun, actually.
Are you engaged in any projects right now?
Yeah, I am. Recently, where I'm living, we have a what's called a climate action committee, and we're trying to decide how to hook up with an outside organization to make our both our role and our imprint a little bit stronger to be part of something bigger than just working within the community. And we're vetting. There's one organization called Third Act, which was started by Bill McKibben, who started, what was the name of it? 350.org.
Yeah,
I
it
think
was
the original.
350.org. I
Anyway, he
just heard him
started,
speak, by the way.
yeah. He started this new thing, or he's co-founded this new organization called Third Act, and it's basically for older people like us.
Yeah.
And the main focus right now is on trying to convince four major banks that supply most of the funding for the fossil fuel industry that they should redirect their activities, put it that way. The other organization is called Elders Climate Action, I think, and it's part of a larger organization for elders. And elders means people, once again, like you and me. And at first I was put off by the term elders.
Yeah.
But in fact, when you think about it, elders, this kind of got a nice ring as elder statesman or something like that. So it may not be anyway.
The wise people.
Yes, yes, the wise people. So we haven't decided yet, but in order to make our efforts more meaningful, we think we should hook up with some organizations like that. And and by the way, the Elders Network and the Third Act are cooperating on this whole thing about the banks. But I'm kind of pessimistic anyway about the effect that we'll have. But who knows? I mean, the whole disinvestment thing around South Africa and apartheid was started on a pretty small scale, and it grew quite large. So,
what did Margaret Mead say? Never underestimate the power of a small group of concerned citizens.
Yeah.
In fact, that's the only thing that's ever made a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all power to you on that.
Yeah.
We can talk about Bill McKibben later, but I was had a fantastic experience listening to him this week. So that's great. So you're still firing on all cylinders. You've got projects going, and you're in touch with major concerns in terms of our well-being on the planet, if I could say it that way.
Yeah.
Kind of curious to know, as we loop back, you gave us an overview of your time in Taiwan, and I thought, well, it's a bit of a trek from Williamstown to Taiwan. How did you show up there to begin with?
Well, I think it will. We touched on it again. The anti-war movement, when we were at Williams, had a big effect, not just on most of us. And from that, I and a course or two with Peter Frost, who taught East Asian history, along with John Houston to some extent. The Reverend Houston, who was the college chaplain, got me interested in that part of the world anyway. And then the Vietnam War was a real flashpoint that, I realized that we have to better understand that part of the world. So that was where the China thing came in. So there were a few of us that ended up pursuing it. And for instance, between my junior and senior year at Williams, I went and studied Chinese at Yale, the summer program. And so I had the basis, at least, for the language. So that was really the beginning of it. And the kind of the rest of the story kind of unfolds from there, somewhat unplanned, somewhat, in other words, I didn't decide when I was a freshman, when I was thinking about being a chemistry major, to go on and go into medicine. And the same thing. I mean, I didn't think when I got an interest in East Asia and in studying Chinese that I would end up living most of my adult life over in East Asia and in Taiwan. So in fact, the first visit I had to Taiwan was when I was, well, we'll get into that. Anyway, my senior year, I applied for the Williams and Hong Kong program. I don't know if it still exists or not, by the way.
We can check up on that.
Yeah. In fact, I was thinking about maybe looking into the Williams magazine, seeing if they've ever written anything about it, because I think it had a pretty big influence upon the people who participated in the program.
I
When I
remember
was,
that it existed, but I'm learning hand over fist from your description about what it was really like.
yeah, it's my understanding that it was John Usden that went over to Asia and specifically to Hong Kong in the kind of the great Peace Corps spirit in the early 60s and thought he would be able to do something. And there was already a Yale program it was called Yale in China. Of course, it wasn't existing in China, but it was in Hong Kong. And he thought he'd establish something different, or something similar. And except he called it, or someone called it Williams in Hong Kong. And what it was a program for people between their junior or senior years or recent graduates to go over and teach English in a program just for the summers. And the program was for teachers of English in the secondary school system in Hong Kong. It was kind of like a way to expose them to native speakers and give them extra practice and that kind of thing. But I think it was more for the Williams participants than for the students that were in the courses. Anyway, as an adjunct to that and as a way to keep it going, there was one Williams of the 6 that went over each summer. One of them would stay in Hong Kong, teach at one of the colleges of the Chinese university to help administer the program and organize it for the following summer. By my years, 67, 68, they decided to increase that from 1 to 2 that would stay over for the year. 1 to administer and organize the program, and another person just to be an extra person that would teach all year in the college and I guess help out to some extent, although I didn't do any of that. So here I applied, and there were 6 of us that went over. I don't remember all the people, but the person that was chosen to go over there to help administer and organize the program was Michael Morfitt. And I think the program had a profound influence on both of us. I decided to apply to graduate school in East Asian history, and Michael met his wife over there and went on to do all kinds of work for various, I think the Quakers originally, and then for this State Department at USAID and all over in India, Indonesia, the Philippines. So he was all over the place, much more than I, but he met his wife over there. She was teaching at the same college. So, and there were others, I think. There's one guy named Leo Murray. The name just came to me. He was early in the program in the early 60s, maybe 62, 63. He stayed in Hong Kong. As far as I know, he's still there.
Yeah.
He was the head of advertising for Reader's Digest for many years, believe it or not.
Oh my gosh.
And
let
then
me briefly intervene here, because you did mention going to graduate school. So that's another turn in the road. You're engaged in teaching and helping support this Williams in Hong Kong program, and then comes East Asian Studies. What was it like to shift environments, and tell us about that experience?
Well, I applied to graduate schools, and I got into Washington University in St. Louis and Berkeley, and I decided to go to Washington University rather than Berkeley because I thought the atmosphere was so charged politically at Berkeley that I wouldn't spend any time studying and all the time protesting and whatnot. Little did I know, but anyway, I ended up at Washington University and had a really positive graduate school experience. I think for a lot of graduate students that I knew, it was kind of drudgery, or it was kind of like learning a trade. Where I was lucky that there were 2 professors in the China field. They were both young, exciting, and were getting started, and they were motivators because they were trying to do things in the field that weren't being done up until that time. In pre-modern China, I mean, there was very little real history in pre-modern China written by Western historians, but or by any historians other than the classical sense of the way history is written in China. So it was very exciting. Plus, there was a professor that I ended up doing some study with, kind of on a strange basis. A guy named John Pocock. His full name was J.G.A. Pocock, or John Greville Agar Pocock, who later went on to write these monumental works like The Machiavellian Moment. His main field was English intellectual history, but he also wrote about Republican history, whether in Europe or in the United States. He wrote a lot. So that was exciting to meet someone like that and try and understand where he was coming from and where he was going to. So it was overall a very positive experience for me. I don't regret going to graduate school at the time. And then, once again, I was quite fortunate in the sense that to study under people like that.
Okay. So from graduate school, as I understand, you went back to Taiwan. How did that happen? And give us the follow through on that, if you could.
Well, I finished my coursework and I took the exams, and I went to Taiwan to do research on a PhD dissertation. That's where a lot of people went, because there were various archives there, or there were various in terms of language, and there were people that, if you were doing anything contemporary, there were people that were still alive that you could interview. So that was my plan, at least, but it didn't work out that way. Within a year, probably less than a year, I was I befriended some journalists over there, and one of them was leaving, and she asked me if I was interested in taking over the NBC string. That was a stringer job, not a full-time, but part-time. And I said, no, it'll take too much time away from my research. And she said, oh, no, it doesn't take much time at all, and it's easy money. I said, that sounds great to me. So someone came over from Hong Kong for NBC, and they interviewed two or maybe three people, and I was offered the job. And I don't know if I was consciously prepared to not completely abandon, because I kept doing some research, but kind of one thing led to another. One of the things was, this was back in the 70s, and if I finished a dissertation, the chances of getting a job, there weren't a whole lot of jobs open at the time. This is before China opened up, or really opened up. So there are a lot of schools, or there are very few schools that had even an East Asian program. So I didn't relish the idea of going to, I don't know, somewhere in the South. Or a friend of mine that I knew later actually was at University of Nebraska, and kind of a prestigious position. But I once went to Lincoln, Nebraska. Boy, I'm glad I didn't finish my PhD. That's all I have to say. And it was exciting. It was exciting being a journalist, in the sense that I was being paid to talk to for the most part, to talk to pretty interesting people. Not always, but and the idea of being able to find out a story, or at least find out something about a story, either I was assigned or I was working on, was in some ways like, not, I would say, doing an academic essay or anything, but at least you had to put together a puzzle or something, or tell a good story, that kind of thing. So I very much enjoyed it. And there were various differences. Radio work was fun because it was so immediate. You just found out you covered a story, you went back, you wrote it up, I recorded it, and then with these strange electronic devices, not so strange, just using alligator clips from the speaker part of the telephone, hooked up from the tape recorder into the speaker form of the telephone, that would send it over the telephone wires. So it was very immediate. Yeah, I could turn out a story in like easily 15 or 20 minutes. So these weren't long. Once again, the NBC had a 24-hour news network when I first started working for them, and they needed a lot of stories from everywhere. but that didn't last too long. But anyway, it was fun. It was exciting, very immediate. So, and the TV work was something that I just had to learn. I was never on camera. I was mainly kind of a organizer, a gopher. There would be a big crew that would come in for any kind of major story, a producer, correspondent, sound man, cameraman, sometimes an editor. And we would work there, and I would set things up for them. So we'd go from place to place. So I would set up all the programs, the interviews, or where we would go to film, organize a car to transport it. And if there weren't someone in that group of people that could speak Chinese, I would go along. I would be the interpreter. So it was interesting. It was quite fulfilling. And I got to write for a lot of interesting people, interesting organizations, Newsweek, Business Week, Far Eastern Economic Review, those kinds of things. So it was a lot of fun. And I got to use, I must say, I was using a lot of the tools that I developed as a graduate student, or as, for that matter, as an undergraduate at Williams. So although I must say I had to, I hate to use the word deconstruct, I had to learn how to write much more simply than I did writing academic papers.
There is merit to that.
Yeah.
Simplify.
Yeah.
I'm in the background wondering how much of this work you did would have been in Taiwanese, or I don't know if you knew Mandarin or.
Well, Mandarin is main language. I learned, yeah. I was pretty fluent in Mandarin, in the sense that one test of fluency, a good friend of mine would say, is to be able to have a 20 to 30 minute discussion with someone and not really say anything, if you know what I mean. All right.
That's fantastic.
I could do that pretty well. Taiwanese is much more difficult. Mandarin is both a national language in Taiwan and in China. And it's got the simplicity of having only 4 tones. Chinese languages are tonal. Yes. So it has only 4.
Yeah.
Taiwanese has 8.
I didn't know that it had 8. Oh, yeah. That's getting close to a record. Yeah.
Well, it's not. Cantonese has more.
Cantonese has more?
Yeah.
I think, yeah. Well, I'm actually a linguist, so I could go down a blind alley with all this stuff. But
the weird thing about Taiwanese, though, just as very briefly, it has 8 tones, but all of them change. In other words, each one changes according to, if it's for instance, if a first tone, it always changes to a 4th tone. That kind of thing. It doesn't change from a 4th tone, say, to a 6th tone. It always changes from one tone to another one. But the rules for how they change are like somewhat like English grammar. There are a lot of exceptions. So,
so that must have been really easy.
Oh, well, I studied Taiwanese in order so that I could go and hear campaign speeches, because most of Taiwan is the native language is Taiwanese rather than Mandarin. Right. And you go to outside of the major cities, even sometimes in the major cities, the language of the campaign speeches is going to be Taiwanese. And I wanted to be able to understand that. Unfortunately, and my Taiwanese never got that good.
From what you describe, you'll have to be born there to manage all those tonal shifts. What
really turned the trick for me in terms of my kind of realizing that I could probably never learn Taiwanese sufficiently to survive in that kind of a atmosphere was that I could make, but I couldn't hear the difference between boy and girl.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That's intriguing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of them has a beginning consonant that's between, well, you would understand this much more than I, between B and an M. Mm-hmm. In the sense that when you think about the B and the M, the placement of the lips and whatnot are very similar. And you would know that much better than I.
Yeah.
But there's that sound. It's not a B and it's not an M, but it's in between. All right. So, anyway.
So how did you transition from this very exciting journalistic role involving all different media, right? There was TV,
Yeah,
radio, and
yeah.
actually you were cranking out audio for folks and then also writing a great deal. You mentioned something about working for a bank. I'm very curious to know how you move from one to the other.
Yeah, I used to interview a lot. I ended up doing before Taiwan. Well, put it this way: there were a fair number of political stories in Taiwan, but the major stories that I found supplied most of my writing and my attention were business type stories, and because that Taiwan was rapidly changing, and there's a lot of attention focused on its economic development and how rapidly. Remember, it was when the U.S. broke off relations with Taiwan that year, 78, 79. I think the economic growth was 12 or 13% that year, right?
That's astonishing.
Yeah, it was. And so there was a lot of attention on that. So I got to know there was in the American Chamber of Commerce, they had a bank committee or something, and the man who was head of that was a banker for Continental Bank. And so I used to interview him fairly often. And he then switched, he was asked and became the head of the Taiwan's first mutual funds company. And at that time, the head of the company, believe it or not, had to proof all the English language reports that were put out for international investors, primarily through one fund. And he just didn't want this person from a Continental Bank decided he didn't want to spend any time doing that. So he asked me to come in and write the reports, and also at the same time set up a desktop publishing program. This is in the mid 80s, when desktop publishing was first being started. Before that, people would use IBM Selectrix, and they would type stuff out, and then it would be you'd have to proofread that, and the changes would be made, and then it would be sent to a printer. The printer would set it in a type. The printer would send it back. You'd have to proofread that. So it was a pretty laborious, time-consuming process. With desktop publishing, you don't need to do that, at all. Yeah. And so that was fun setting that up, and starting doing the reports. And the company, through this guy that had been at Continental Bank, was really exciting place to work. The analysts were all young MBAs from American universities. They're very bright, very interesting people, and it was just an exciting place to work. And I was just one of the group. I never felt like, there was the head of the company, and there was me, and that was it. Everyone else working there was Chinese, but I never felt like I stood out or was treated special or anything like that. So it was a great experience.
How many years altogether were you in Taiwan?
31.
31.
Yeah, 31
Wow.
years.
So that's an impressive.
But the other great things about Taiwan is besides the people, and they're very, very open society, I think, for a Chinese society. Much more open, I think, than in Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong suffered because it had been a British colony, and there was this kind of somewhat of a separation between Westerners and Chinese. All right. In Taiwan, even there wasn't that separation. I mean, no, I went into homes of a lot of my Chinese friends or people that I knew. I mean, it wasn't unusual to interact and have relationships with people and their families. So it was really good. It was a interesting experience. Plus, the other two things are the food. The food is some of the best in the world. Remember, in the case of Taiwan, there were a lot of refugees that came over when the communists were taking over in China. And so you had people representing all these different areas of China. So you had all these regional cuisines represented in Taiwan. Some of them are very, very good. And I became a member of a very informal group that met every Wednesday night, and we go to different restaurants. And it's still going on. It's been going on now for it's approaching its 50th year in existence. So, and once again, during the course of the year, you might repeat some of the same restaurants, but you'd always look for new and exciting places to go. And primarily, primarily Chinese, but over the years, they would go to more other Asian places, whether they're Thai. There are a lot of Thai restaurants. There's some Burmese restaurants, things like that. So it was very an interesting sidelight to living in Taiwan. And the other thing is that still eating in restaurants is, compared to Hong Kong or this country, relatively inexpensive. You can go and have a good meal in a Chinese restaurant, drink as much beer as you want, which is of course an important part of any meal, and spend probably on average around $15 a person.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, it is. So the other part about it is that the countryside in Taiwan is really beautiful and it's easy to get to. I used to take hikes oftentimes on the weekends. You take a taxi ride just in the hills above Taiwan, above Taipei, the capital city, and you could start on a hike and walk all day, 7-8 hours, and end up on the other side of a mountain, or the hills, and end up near the northern port of Keelung, and have a nice seafood meal, because Keelung is a port, right? And then make it back to Taiwan back to Taipei, the capital, by bus. It's a great outing for a day, and the weather for the most part allows that. I mean, except you can always hit rain, but if you're lucky on the weekends, you can avoid that. So that was interesting too.
Are you ever tempted? These memories must be quite strong after all that time.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I was thinking back also on, you hit this point about, you hit this thing about, well, these Eastern cultures or whatnot, they're hard to understand. At first, when I went over there, I was thinking about this the last few days, that I always thought that, it's not so difficult to understand if you first have to understand where you come from, in the sense that, at least at the beginning, and I could be wrong about this, and the metaphor I used was, it was like a mirror, that you're looking at yourself, and if you're not aware of where you come from, it's harder to understand the kind of cultural milieu that you're living in, the difference. And that was what I used to think. Although now, I mean, having lived over there and absorbed it to some extent, I think it's not as much of an intellectual effort as I originally thought then. I think it's just more of absorbing it, and I would say by osmosis. I wouldn't use that metaphor, but it's accepting of it, being certain, in some ways open to it.
Well, there's a thread that's common between our two lives, although I never lived for 31 years in a place that wasn't the United States. But I did spend a lot of time in Brazil, and it started out with the Peace Corps. And I found that was a transformative experience. I was exposed to other ways of thinking, other ways of interacting, and it permanently changed how I looked at the world. I began to value behaviors and attitudes that before weren't apparent to me. It was a whole new world. Does that ring a bell to you at all?
Yeah, that to some extent. One of the things that is very strong that I got from living over in Asia, and it may just be my special experience, is that friendships mean much more. In other words, I'm still good friends with people that I first met in Hong Kong more than 50 years ago. I mean, good friends that we regularly communicate. The same is true. I mean, although it's only been 40-something years in Taiwan. I mean, I'm still very close to some of the people I worked with, the Chinese people, and they do things for me without even asking. I mean, there's certain kinds of things that I want from Taiwan that I can't get anywhere else, and they'll send them to me. It's pretty amazing, and I know about their children, and some of them, I had children that were babies when I left. It's been 15 years, more than 15 years, and they're now grown up. So I've kind of, because I've maintained these relationships, I I see their children growing up, and friends of mine that were younger, much younger than me, they're retiring now. So it's been astounding. The friendship is really important. It's one of the things I've gotten from from my experience in both Hong Kong and in Taiwan. So
It sounds like you're suggesting that there's greater possibility for intimacy and truly getting to know each other. Am I hearing that right? Or
I don't know what to compare it to,
yeah,
Alexander, because I didn't stay in this country. For instance,
yeah,
maybe if email had been available when we were at Williams and afterwards, I would have stayed in touch with more people that I knew back then.
yeah.
It's hard to say. It just so happens that I spent so much of my life over there that it was easy to maintain the friendship, the relationship.
Well, I think that's wonderful. And seeing the shift as generations progress and you're still part of people's lives,
Yeah.
that's huge.
Yeah.
We're coming up on an hour, and I don't want us to get parched throats or anything. So,
Yeah.
but I do want to touch back on your notion of serendipity. Now, as I listen to your story, and I can compare it with my own and others, it comes to mind that there is a flux and flow that might be more common to people in our generation with our experience than those who might have come before us. Although certainly not saying this didn't happen, but
Yeah.
there's a sequence of events and choices that you make that you use the word serendipity. As I hear your story, I hear a lot of determination, and I hear things like a skill set evolving and being applied in new and different ways. You're a writer. You're an excellent writer, but you can transform that into audio or any other medium. You can transform complex technical information that a bank might produce and make it comprehensible to others. But even being a writer might not capture it all. Am I off the mark there?
Well, you're seeing a string of things that I never would have thought of, in the sense that I use the term serendipity in the sense that it was unplanned, almost accidental. A lot of it had to do with just luck. My making friends, for instance, with some journalists in Taiwan, who then recommended that I might want to consider at least journalism for a short while. My deciding, rather than to go straight to graduate school after Williams in some way, shape, or form, to try the Williams in Hong Kong experience, that kind of thing. Or for that matter, just, the whole idea of that I was pushed along in a certain flow that we were all, that I was swallowed up by, for instance, the Vietnam War, the interest in East Asia. I mean, rather than say, from the very beginning deciding I'm going to be a lawyer, I'm going to go to law school, I'm going to first get a good undergraduate education. In other words, that kind of thing. I mean, I didn't have a plan. I didn't,
Well, I guess my point is you are absolutely not alone in that regard.
Yes.
And I think that characterizes a lot of our generation, in that there have been a lot of turns. I've had 4 professions.
Yeah.
As I move forward, we can talk about that offline.
Sure.
And I think it's absolutely fascinating to hear how you've progressed and to know that you're still extremely active in a very important project. So I want to thank you again, Dirk, for agreeing to join us. And I will be in touch about the final steps and producing this into the polished version. A lot of that will have to do with my editing my own verbiage, but
sure.
Anyway, so I'm sure this isn't the last conversation you and I will have, but
okay, very
many
good.
Thanks, and thanks for your contribution.
Okay, it's been a lot of fun, Alexander.
Yeah, we'll be in touch.
Okay,
Thanks.
great.
Bye.
Thank